morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dave Cohn. I'm Executive Director of Public Affairs here at the Union League Club of Chicago, and I am the opening act. So welcome to the club and to the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability's annual fiscal symposium. What I'd like to do is just very briefly set the stage for this morning's conversation and today's symposium. First of all, I'd like to begin by thanking our friends at CTBA and Ralph Martiri and Tracy and the entire group that has brought this wonderful and important program here to the club year after year. And this morning when Ralph and I met outside the room, he said, "I don't know what I'm going to do with myself. We actually have some good news to talk about." So we will do our best to depress him if possible, but he's an endlessly optimistic guy. But we want to thank you for being here, and I would like to just mention a few words about the Union League Club of Chicago and why it is so appropriate that this event is held here, this gathering is held here. Ladies and gentlemen, you are in the only private club in the United States that has an institutional commitment to public policy advocacy. The reason for that is connected to our history and our founding. This club is the descendant of a movement that arose during the Civil War in Pekin, Illinois in 1862 that called itself the Union Leagues of America. The Union Leagues of America movement was a pretty straightforward volunteer group. They wanted to do whatever they could to help President Lincoln defend the Union. That's where the Union and the Union League Club name comes from. What they primarily did was raise money for the Union Army, and they did that quite well, and this movement of support for the Union began to proliferate throughout the northern states, and at the height of the war in 1864, there were almost 2 million Americans affiliated with these Union League of America chapters all across the northern states. The war came to a close, and these organizations largely disbanded. People went back to their daily lives, but not here in the Chicago area, which was near the birthplace of this movement. These folks did not want to disband their fellowship, and they kept meeting in the years after the Civil War to talk about what they referred to as the sacred obligations of citizenship. And those included things not only supporting those who serve in our military to defend our constitutional freedoms, but being actively involved in civic affairs as citizens, as organizations, as community groups, being informed, keeping tabs on those elected to serve us, being vigilant, and being mindful of our obligations as citizens in this democratic republic. And for that reason, and to an effort to inculcate those values and sustain them in future generations, they founded this club in 1879. And we have continued for the last 138 years with a dedicated program of civic affairs, programming, and advocacy. And it is in that context that we are so delighted to convene the CTBA Symposium today. You know, I talked about, briefly alluded to our obligations as citizens. We have a number of famous members of the club, some of whom are no longer with us, and one of those is President Theodore Roosevelt. And I assume there are a lot of folks in this room who are familiar with Teddy Roosevelt's legacy, of course. And I was thinking in the context of today's program about a particularly meaningful and well-known address that he gave at the Sorbonne in 1910 that was entitled Citizenship in a Republic, talking about what are the obligations of citizens in a republic. And the very famous passage in that speech in which he talks about, and this of course was the male-centric language of his era, the man in the arena, right? And I just wanted to share a few of these words with you because they were meaningful in the context, I think, of today's gathering. Roosevelt said, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." Ladies and gentlemen, the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability and Ralph Martiri for many years have been the man in the arena. All of you today are citizens in the arena who care about what's happening in our state, care about the future of education and the way that we fund education in our state. And so it is with great pleasure that I now yield the lectern to the chairman of the CTBA Board of Directors, David May. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Our symposium is held annually and focuses on various policy matters affecting the state of Illinois' budget and fiscal condition. I'd like to thank Dave Cohn and the Public Affairs Committee of the Union League Club for their hospitality and hosting our event again this year. I'd like to also thank our sponsors, AFSCME Council 31, ADDIX Asset Management, Federation of Independent Illinois Colleges and Universities, the Illinois Association of School Administrators, the Illinois Association of School Boards, the Illinois Association of School Business Officials, the Illinois Education Association, the Illinois Federation of Teachers, Illinois Principals Association, State University Annuitants Association, and the University Professionals of Illinois Local 41. I'd like to also thank CTBA Symposium Committee and volunteers for their time in preparing this event. If those committee members and volunteers in attendance would please stand when your name is called. Jean Sussman, Jane Lehman, Carlene Lutz, Deb Bandy, Gloria Martir, Vasil Marcus, Kathy Nesberg, Addison Woodward, Marlise Trover, Daniel Espada, and Gabby Roman. Thank you very much, everyone. And whether it's producing the fact-based analysis about the fiscal condition in Illinois, or handling our day-to-day operations behind the scenes of the organization, all of this could not be done without the expertise and efforts of the CTBA staff. Our budget director, Bobby Otter, research director, Daniel Hertz, development director, Sydney Smith, and administrative director, Tracy Schoenberger. Special thanks to CAN TV, Chicago Cable Channel 27, which is streaming our event at cantv.org/live. We're also grateful for the collaborative effort of so many that are here in attendance today to ensure that Illinois policymakers are informed and able to support economic justice initiatives. Perhaps you are not aware that CTBA does this important work on a very, very small budget. This superb 501 organization, tax-exempt 501 organization, relies on contributions from individuals and organizations such as yours. These contributions are especially important now, given the state of Illinois' financial crisis. Donation cards are available on your table, and we would much appreciate a donation. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce CTBA's Executive Director, Ralph Martiri.
Well, good morning. You know, it's an interesting time in Illinois, and how many of you have worked with me over the years? Can I just see a show of hands? A lot of people in this room, right? When was any time you've seen me a little giddy? It just doesn't happen. And yet we're at a unique moment of time in this state when we can be a little giddy. I mean, we've done some really big things this summer through the efforts of a bipartisan group of legislators and a number of advocates who have kept the nose to the grindstone to get a budget passed over a veto, to get a tax increase over a veto, and to pass an education funding model that overnight transformed Illinois from having the most inequitable education funding system in America to the best. That just doesn't happen in a typical week, month, year. So we should all be very happy that Illinois is taking some very positive steps forward. And it's my great honor to bring up now Terry Mazzani. Now, I don't know how many of you know Terry, but he's one of these individuals that's always understood the value of education. I mean, he didn't just invest in it when he ran the Chicago Community Trust. He actually got his hands dirty running CPS. All the bios are in the books, and so I'm not going to talk about his bio, but I'm going to talk about him. How many nonprofits just have that anguished, mixed feeling about dealing with their funders? Can't really be honest about your warts. Gotta try to find a way to take your square peg and bang it into their round hole. Always trying to get on the agenda and being deferred, put off. Terry Mazzani headed one of the largest foundations in Illinois. He was accessible. I could meet with him whenever. And we wouldn't just talk about funding the CTBA, we would talk about education. We would talk about its role in creating social and economic justice. We would talk about the inequities in the current system and what are the best ways to approach those inequities. And I can tell you this, Terry Mazzani absolutely knew what needed to be done to move this state and frankly our nation forward when it comes to education policy. We are thrilled to honor Terry today, and so I'd like Terry to come up, and I'm going to give you an award from the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability for all your hard work for education over the years, Terry. It's been an honor.
Thank you all for that warm applause, and thanks to Ralph and the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. Yeah, Ralph and I go way back. Everything he said about me is absolutely true, except for getting my hands dirty at CPS. We had the squeaky clean administration, absolutely, during that era. And Carlene knows that for a fact. So I can talk hours about education. I'm a little stunned that on the agenda it allows me only 30 minutes for that. But I want to have everybody kind of get oriented. Pretend you're back at the university, because this is going to be a little academic in a way, but I think it's a wonderful inflection point given the good news out of Springfield to chart the course. And I'm going to be focusing specifically on that part about the future of education. It goes well beyond Illinois, but the future part, but I'm going to have to go backwards to go forward for that. So let me start my journey here. As Ralph alluded, the through line for my career at the Chicago Community Trust has absolutely been education. And it was following the retirement of Bruce Newman in 1999 that the Executive Committee of the Trust established a new strategic plan in the year 2000 that prioritized education and allocated a third of its discretionary grant making to education, which was $10 million a year, which at that point in time was a lot of money. The board hired Don Stewart as the CEO to succeed Bruce Newman. Don had come most recently from the College Board, but he'd been president of Spelman, and he was brought in with that emphasis. Don, in turn, hired me as the education director. I had been in and out of Chicago working on things like the Annenberg Challenge, was aware of what was going on, but an unusual candidate. I wasn't from Chicago, and so this city does not always welcome outsiders coming into its midst for that. I was pleased to join Peggy Miller, who's just a rock star for education grant making, and then later Gedalia Lopez joined the team for that. My first task was to develop guidelines for the education grant making, and this was built upon extensive volumes of research that John Simmons had done before he started strategic learning, but really benefited from a national look at the state of school reform. One of my very first meetings, it was in April of that year, I met with the young chief of staff for Paul Vallis. We had breakfast together at the 312 and speculated about what we would do if we were in charge of CPS. We both agreed that the priorities were literacy, teacher quality, principal leadership, innovative models of schooling. Then a couple months later, that young chief of staff was selected as CEO of CPS. That was Arnie Duncan. Because I didn't have a portfolio to manage, Don Stewart allowed me to be embedded inside CPS, working part-time on Arnie's strategic planning team, with Melissa Rodwick was an important part of that, and with Barbara Eason Watkins. And because I was coming from a background of education, I could talk their talk, and so it wasn't just a philanthropoid on the outside conjecturing about school improvement. I had walked the walk with them, and we developed a really strong relationship that endured for the next 8 years. And it was no accident that the priorities of CPS look very much like the grant priorities of the Chicago Public Schools, and enabled the Chicago Community Trust to invest at least $5 million a year in strengthening curriculum rigor, teacher quality, principal leadership. A lot of seeds that you see sprouted today, things like the Urban Leadership Academy at UIC have their origins in that. But now let me step back and put all of this work into a broader context. So I consider the modern era of school reform to have been launched by the release of A Nation at Risk in 1983. It was that clarion call, that we are under attack. If a foreign power were to impose this education system on us, we would not tolerate that. But it was this focus on increasing curriculum standards, strengthening the curriculum programming, training teachers, and an important lesson learned during the 80s and 90s was the notion of whole school change. It wasn't just about training individual teachers and principals, but it was the school as a whole needed to change. And during the 90s, you had the MacArthur Foundation and the Annenberg Challenge as the premier funders, providing substantial support for this education improvement effort and innovation. And CPS would be able to bring in professors like Tim Shanahan to lead the literacy effort. And it was all about content rigor at that point. And at the time, there was that cap on charter schools of 15, and those schools were focused on innovation. So you had Namaste, and you had Perspectives with a disciplined life and things like that arriving there. As that funding wound down, that's when the trust kind of kicked in and took its place in this effort. This was also the era of site-based management that heralded in the passage of the legislation 1988 that established local school councils. We had Designs for Change led by Dawn Moore, who was instrumental in this work. I see Ann Howlett here. She is also a champion through all of this period of time. And even though the legislation passed and CPS set up the bureaucracy to host elections, but at the end of the day, my observation then and now is that resources were not allocated to really implement that. And those are resources to train and support the local school councils so that they could truly flourish there. And I think that's an important part of the story. In the 90s, we also saw the formation of the Consortium on Chicago School Research, led by the amazing Tony Bright. The longitudinal data collection capacity has been the essential engine for sustained school reform in Chicago. And if you think about, if any of you are from communities elsewhere and you want to energize your school reform efforts, invest in creating a consortium, a data consortium to manage that, because long-term you need those longitudinal studies. And they've produced a succession of brilliant reports that have led the way to deepen our understanding of what it takes to help to elevate the performance of schools for this. And we had Catalyst with Linda Lenz, and it was the truth teller in the objective, honest voice, providing another viewpoint about the state of education in our community. These two components of infrastructure are a great lesson for foundations to think it's not just funding the direct services, but in fact, there's infrastructure that needs to support the work broadly. And most often, foundations are the only resource available for that. And of course, the key product from Tony Breik and the consortium was their theory of change, encapsulated by the 5 essential supports that remain the gold standard for education improvement. And its success is realized by being incorporated into the school report cards produced by CPS. So, by the 2000s, the model for whole school change was well established. There were substantial investments in curricular rigor and teacher training, the rise of kind of national standards. You had the curriculum groups, National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, for instance, moving forward for that. Arnie turned his focus to raising standards for the district, raising graduation requirements, establishing AP courses at all high schools to get at the issue of equity and access, and started the early IB programs, all of which the impact was well documented by the consortium's 3 Eras report, which shows the dramatic improvement in student achievement at that period of time. Arnie also embraced the Polk Brothers Foundation pilot of community schools, and him and Beth Swanson worked together to scale the original 6 schools to over 100, and a number of those are still flourishing today. That was also the peculiar period when Gates Foundation thought they had the right answer with small schools, injected a boatload of money, and I have the interesting distinction of having been part of the Chicago High School Redesign Initiative, CHSRI, launching the creation of the small schools, and then as CEO of CPS, closing the last of the small schools. So it was interesting bookends that my career has taken me there. In the 2000s, we also had the passage of No Child Left Behind, which shifted the focus from standards and quality to accountability and testing. And in my view, it was NCLB which brought to a close the modern era of school reform by pushing to the limits the existing frameworks of school reform that collapsed under the regimen of over-testing, and it fell to the free market paradigm of school competition. So we find ourselves now in this post-modern era of school reform, which I'll come back to. But it was also during the 2000s that Jim Heckman's research on early childhood learning took root, and the state took a bold step to dramatically increase funding for preschool, with 3 incredible anchor organizations leading the way: OUNCE, Action for Children, and Erickson. And Barbara Bowman being the steadfast champion throughout all of this. Arnie's biggest challenge during this decade was, his own words, was to move from islands of excellence to a system of excellence. This has always been the holy grail for school districts across the country, and only a few have succeeded in this standard, such as Long Beach and Montgomery County. And with this, Arnie had the courage to begin closing failing schools. That first one was quite an adventure for that, as well as to pilot and grow innovative approaches for school closings that did not displace students, just the staff. That was the seeds of the Academy for Urban School Leadership, and that had actually been founded by Mike Koldyke, who was a member of my board at the trust for that. So moving forward with innovative schools, the Civic Committee weighed in with the mayor to launch the Renaissance Schools Fund led by Phyllis Lockett. And it was clearly no secret that Eden Martin, the head of the Civic Committee, was a staunch supporter of charter school replication and expansion and fought to lift the cap at the state and use the Renaissance Schools Fund to grow the number of charters during this period of time. And I think this planted the seeds for then what became the charter school wars this period of time. Coincidentally, this was the time of the Chicago Housing Authority's plan for transformation that demolished 25,000 units of public housing, with the collateral impact of emptying out dozens of schools on Chicago's south and west sides. In fact, Warren Chapman, who at the time was with J.P. Morgan, he and I were studying this, and we had this notion of a Mid-South initiative when he brought together the fact that all of these schools like Donahue's populations just zeroed out and what was going to happen in this area, but there was no real hearing for that impact. CHA was in a silo and not connected to the public schools. But the consequences of that policy, having not been thought all the way through, would reverberate a decade later when Mayor Emanuel then directed the closing of 50 schools in the wake of that. For that. So those are the ramifications there. During this era, school funding was a perennial challenge, and we had the collective efforts of the A+ Coalition that advocated for increased funding, but ultimately was not successful. CTBA was a critical partner for all of this stuff, providing honest data and information and sound policy guidance for this work. And you know, as I said earlier, many of you know that prior to my career at the Trust, I was a public school administrator, and I had imagined at the time that my career would culminate in being a school superintendent. But then I became an accidental philanthropist and have enjoyed this career immensely, but leave it to Mayor Daley to enable me to realize my dream of being a superintendent by appointing me to lead the schools in the transition from his administration to Mayor Emanuel. And what I find curious is on the street, teachers, principals will still come up to me and they will congratulate me, thank me for my 2 years of service heading up the Chicago Public Schools, when in reality it was only 6 months. But the legend has grown. I think at some point, if I live long enough, I'll be there about a decade, it'd be my guess for that. But it was a very intense time. It was also the last time that the district had a budget surplus. We conducted the school capacity study at that point in time and identified that, and there was a roadmap for how to manage the overcapacity for that. And we had a fabulous relationship with the CTU, and the Chicago Teachers Union President Karen Lewis. It was extraordinary. She and I went to a labor management conference together and mapped out there was a fork in the road. We could either build a collaborative approach to addressing the school challenges, or we could fight, and that path led to Armageddon. History has shown that path was chosen, and we ended up with Armageddon and the school strike for that. And then when I talk about the charter wars, during that 6 months, I was caught squarely in the middle of those wars. During my first month as CPS CEO, the board agenda included several proposals for new charter schools. In my view, they were not well prepared for a board decision, so I pulled them from the board agenda. So I was immediately hailed as the hero of the anti-charter forces there for pulling these off. Then the following month, we put some back on for board action, and I was immediately hailed as the hero for the charter school movement. So I thought I threaded that needle pretty well for that. But I think now, 2017, the reality is that that battle has been won by those who favor choice. And there's not a lot to be gained by continuing to fight that battle. My own disappointment, though, is the duplicitous behavior of those protecting the ideology of charter schools at all costs and not willing to hold them accountable and to close them down based upon the rhetoric that they say. It's by keeping the thumb on the scale, I think these ideologues of charter schools are doing everyone a disservice and undercut their own argument for letting the market forces work. But that being said, we need to move beyond the charter wars and return our focus to quality. And that means something very, very different than it did 20 years ago. I talked earlier about the collapse of the school reform era launched by A Nation at Risk, but as a result, we find ourselves in this postmodern malaise when it comes to education reform. When I do see innovation, it's everywhere but inside traditional school systems. You could even say that Phyllis Lockett anticipated the future or saw the writing on the wall when she launched Leap Learning to bring entrepreneurial energy from the outside to innovate for learning. But the revolution that is underway is challenging the very notion of schooling and the place learning occurs. We see this most clearly in the MacArthur Foundation's decade-long investment in digital learning, led at the time by Connie Yao, who then adroitly transitioned herself to lead the outstanding work of curriculum into now a new endeavor called Collective Shift. It's from that work that we got the U Media Centers, for instance, that saw a different relationship of young people and technology for that, and it launched LRNG, and if you're not familiar with that, I would invite you to check out their website, lrng.org, and look at some of the videos. This is coupled with investments in the Hive Connected Learning and the Hive Fund led by Maria Hibbs, which has really kicked open the door for disruptive innovation and learning. And the way I think about this is that it used to be in cities like Chicago that the movement of people from one place to another by a hired car was governed by the issuance of a taxi cab medallion bolted to the hood of that taxi. Then along comes Uber, and it disconnects the requirement of a medallion from the movement of people. Disruptive innovation. We're at the very same moment, the same phenomena in education. And as soon as digital innovation can sever the monopoly authority of schools and districts to credential academic achievement, it's game over for traditional schooling. Sure, this will be a slow rolling transformation, but once it begins, it will definitely pick up school like self-driving cars will be here before we know it. And that's the sort of work that LRNG is doing, building out a suite of digital badges that are starting to gain currency among education institutions and employers. And the work of the Hive Fund is an accelerant, helping to establish those learning pathways that are outside of traditional school that can be credentialed. That is where the future of education lies. But what brings us to the greatest existential threat facing education is the accelerating rate of technological change and the massive scale of job destruction. A rationale for education has always been its value to prepare people for the world of work. But what happens when there is no work to prepare for, or when the skills required to keep current and relevant are changing so rapidly that what is learned in school is obsolete by the time students graduate and enter the workforce? I've always said that schools must prepare students for their future, not our past, and this is even more apparent in the face of the technological change we face. We need to think only about the new jobs created by technology during the course of our lifetimes: web designers, computer scientists, network administrators, and so on, to understand that this reality of change will continue only at an increasing rate that will stress and stretch the ability of individuals and education systems to keep pace. Business as usual will no longer hold, nor will the traditional glacial pace of school reform. If we thought the charter school wars left many casualties, the coming digital learning revolution will completely disrupt what we believe are the essential tenets of the education process. Think Alexa in the classroom, or for those of you who are hip and know about Vocaloids, think about Hatsune Miku leading a class discussion armed with all the resources of Watson and Alexa. Students will be fully wired to all the information resources that are available for the entirety of human recorded history. So no longer is education as great transmitter of knowledge relevant. It's a different relationship to each other and to how we think about things. But regardless of the direction the future of education takes us, the basic promise of equity of opportunity remains integral to our nation's values, imperfectly realized, but bedrock nonetheless. Advocacy for that promise requires organizations like the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability and knowledgeable leaders like Ralph Materi to lead the good fight for the long haul for those of us and those who don't have a voice. And for that, I'm forever grateful, and we all should be. Thank you very much.
We have a wireless microphone. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Mazzani? Anybody?
Boy,
Oh, I'm sorry.
they're just stunned, cannot believe what they just heard.
Hi, yes, I am stunned. I'm a professor at Northeastern Illinois University, and we pride ourselves on providing some of that equity in opportunity, serving, mostly low-income working-class students who are working their way through college. So I'm wondering what you think the role of teachers will be in this future. I mean, I'm also the parent of a 16-year-old high school student, so I see the digital revolution happening. I participated in it myself. I teach online as well as face-to-face in the classroom, but what will teachers be?
Yeah, it's a great question, and again, it won't happen overnight. There's too much inertia in the system, and there are other functions that schools play. But when I grew up, we talked about the distinction between the sage on the stage and the guide on the side for one definition of teaching. I think as we move forward, where the teacher does not have to have full command of all of the content knowledge, but how to access it and understand the structures of the disciplines. But I think that we're looking more at a model of the classical reference librarian or a concierge who is helping to guide and connect young people on their learning journeys. There's a lot of noise about personalized learning, but if you mean that, then a single teacher cannot, in a traditional role, be that provider of personal learning for every student. So that relationship has to change between the student and the teacher in a way that will look much more of a lighter touch as a reference librarian or a concierge of learning.
Hold on. Here you go.
My background includes digital teaching learning, but in higher education and not K through 12. And based on my experience in higher education, my question about digital learning in K through 12 is, my understanding of one of the goals of education is social interaction among students. With an emphasis on digital learning, how is that interaction in terms of social interaction going to be achieved?
See, you just framed the challenge for educators everywhere is to change the paradigm for what the work of teachers and educators are. Exactly as, when I think about schools that are built around, say, a restorative justice practice, or even Namaste built around, healthy, holistic development of children, I think that allows the adults in the schools to bring to the forefront and be more explicit about a set of learnings about how we relate together as humans in an increasingly crowded planet, and how do we realize values of fairness and justice, truth-telling, and all of that. That becomes then the dominant insight or in situ curriculum, because all the other stuff can be accessed other ways, real time, 24/7. So what does it look like if of the three standards for education of kind of human development, citizenship, and workforce preparation, if all the content moves out, then citizenship, so how do you design a school that is structured around preparing young people? To me, it looks like something that would be dominated by having a lot of model UN type of activities, a lot of service learning, the way that the Free the Children, now called We Charities in Canada, has gone wall to wall, integrating service into the very structure of student learning, so it builds a set of new values and capabilities for young people. We don't do that. We always push that off. It's shunted. Service learning in schools is pushed to the margins or even outside of school. What if we bring that inside?
Could you comment on what you think the role of the federal and state government policy is going to be in this revolution?
I don't think either are very helpful. I think that history has shown either side of the fence that those are generally intrusive. They create a set of bureaucratic challenges and simply build the bureaucracy and provide directions that overburden schools and teachers and administrators with more mandates that, as everybody in the room knows, are unfunded mandates.
You haven't said anything about Common Core. Would you care to comment?
Yeah, but in a way, that's gone the way of the charter school wars as well, becoming this ideological third rail for that. So I think that the term now is kind of the kiss of death for all of that, and again, I would devolve back to the content institutions, teachers of English, teachers of math, science, and so on, to be able to monitor and police and update theirs. And very helpful in this regard, the National National Assessment of Educational Progress and their content frameworks is very good, and for any state that seeks to benchmark itself to high-level curricular content, that is the best standard to use around. And then we see internationally, OECD with PISA is putting a lot of pressure as well on our system to conform to international standards. So at some point you can't avoid the laws of gravity that your curriculum is going to have to teach that 2 + 2 = 4, you know, to kind of be reductionist about it. But it goes back to, doesn't seem that the role of government, the role government has played has not been effective in this regard. We've got Troy over here who's...
Hi, I'm Ann Corder from the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. You referenced early learning in your remarks, and I'm wondering, since we know now that brain development is greatest in the years from 0 to 3, and that poverty can have a huge impact on the rate of brain growth, what is the responsibility for the school districts to look back to birth to support learning and development?
Yeah, I don't see that as the school district's responsibility. I think that's part of our problem, is heaping up too many of these challenges on the district. You know, any teacher, principal, superintendent will tell you what they're responsible for. You know, the fact that my guess would be probably every elementary school in Chicago, the principal has installed a washer dryer to be able to clean the clothes of their students so that they will look nice and not stand out from their peers. For that, you know, and that's a shame. There are other institutions that bear that responsibility, and I would encourage education to keep pushing those to where they belong.
Did you have a question?
You mentioned charter schools. I was recently in a conversation with a principal of a Noble school who was boasting about the scores of her school in relationship to the neighborhood school next to her. And I asked her if there was a difference between the entry and explore scores of the students that would explain the difference in college persistence rates. And she said, oh, they're about the same. And when I looked them up, there was a 4-point difference, which you know is very significant. And so I decided to look at other neighborhood schools that had the same entry and explore scores as they had, and then compare the Nobles and the publics. And the Noble schools were at the bottom of this list. All of them were at the bottom of this list. So it seemed that as they were getting good, high-performing kids in, but preparing them a lot more inadequately. And so when you mention, I say this because I want to pair it with your mentioning of the research partnership at the University of Chicago. I'm not hearing about research that looks into these questions around whether or not the results that these schools are getting have more to do with teaching and learning, or just sifting out the best students. And that's an extremely important question to answer, or to ask and answer, and I never see it asked in these research consortiums.
And so I'm glad that you've elevated that in the set, because I had one sentence about the issue, but it leads to a set of comments that I didn't make as part of my remarks, and that is, as we see the collapse of traditional school reform, then we also see the collapse of the notion of what is a school district and what is its function. In an era of choice, then the notion of having a top-down command and control bureaucracy makes no sense. Particularly as you look at large districts like Detroit, Philadelphia, New Orleans, LA being hollowed out by charter schools, the quid pro quo is then you do need an education authority that is the truth teller and honest broker about performance across all schools. And this is what bothers me about the charter schools, is that they continue to try to get out from under that spotlight of truthful accountability. And instead, because it's in a market environment, it's all about promoting your brand whether or not you're selling a quality product is less important. And so in that brand performance, we need an objective third party, an underwriter's laboratory seal, to be able to give the assurance to parents and community and kids and neighborhoods that, yeah, this is the real deal. Exactly to your point, Troy, that that's the missing piece. And I know that CPS has been trying to do things. The universal enrollment is a first step, but it has to be bolstered with those types of analyses. And to your point, the consortium does need to make sure that it has a research agenda that continues to ask the tough questions.
We have time for one more. Anybody?
Good morning. If you could please share what books are on your top shelf right now that are influencing your thinking.
The Anne-Marie Slaughter's Web and the Chessboard, that's not quite the full title, but that's a very useful one, because as we think about in the middle of a more global shift away from top-down command and control mechanisms to networked solutions. They're much more efficient. The trust on the table is a great example of that, scaling to 100,000 people in a single-day conversation without any more dollars spent than we did at 10,000 people. And so it's the web and the chessboard. Looking at the networking capacities is I think, a very important part of that, for that. And then I think that I can never get his name right, but the book title is Scarcity. The guy's on the board of MacArthur Malalthan or something, but I've never learned how to pronounce his name, but Scarcity is the title, and it gives a very revealing insight into how the brain functions. So if you are a low-income single mother raising 3 kids, why is it that you aren't able to do certain things that, say, more affluent people say, oh, why is that person making that decision? That's really stupid. But in the context, it makes all the sense in the world for that. And so those are 2 that I would add. Okay, thank you all. This was fun.
Well, you know, if you looked at the bios, Terry Mazzani has the shortest bio, and of course the most accomplishments, right? That's how it usually works, and we really appreciate you coming here today to be honored. And CTBA doesn't often honor people. We've done this once before in our 17 years of existence. So this is sort of an exceptional time for us, and we're going to hand out a small award to each of these panelists, and I'm going to introduce them first, the legislators in alphabetical order, and then one of our key partners in this, Mike Jacoby. But I'll tell you, this effort, what was it really all about? You know, it was about education. It was about the education funding formula. You have a short report there that analyzes the bill as it passed. But we at CTBA, we take this think tank stuff pretty seriously, and we actually have some interesting staff meetings where a lot gets discussed. A couple of years ago, the question of the day that we were answering at the staff meeting is, what's the American dream mean to you? Each staff member had to say, what's the American dream? What we came up with at CTBA was pretty simple. It's just that the circumstances of your birth ought not dictate limits on your life. In America, you should be able to realize whatever it is you have the ability to do. Now, unfortunately, public sector systems frequently designed to create social and economic justice get in the way of that dream. And in Illinois, one of the systems, in fact, that has done that has traditionally been our K-12 education system. And I'm saying that because the correlations between your educational attainment and your economic viability not only have never been stronger than they are now, they're compelling. And in fact, those states that did the best, investing in all their children, building the capacity of every school to educate kids pursuant to what those kids need, have had the strongest economic growth, huge advantages in median wage, unemployment rate, job creation, all that stuff. So it's really, really a landmark thing that this state did, was to move to the evidence-based model of school funding reform, which is all about building capacity. It's all about building the capacity of every school to meet the needs of the unique children that walk through its door. It's a very different approach to education funding, but it's really one that would put us on a path to go to a place where Illinois actually invests in what will move all its kids forward and give all its children the opportunity to not only be successful and realize the American dream economically, but to be active and really involved members of our modern democracy. Really will make a difference. And it wouldn't have happened without each of the panelists I'm going to invite in. So first, Representative Will Davis, could you please come up? I was instructed to stand over here. I thought I would need a microphone. Will, when did you first join the legislature? 2003. You know when you first worked on education funding reform? 2003. When you first came in. Thanks, Will, for coming in. Take your seat. Any seat you want. Our next legislator is Senator Kim Lightford. Kim? Now, what you may not know is that Representative Davis and Senator Lightford were the first two people to introduce the evidence-based model as legislation in the state of Illinois. Kim? What? I got to move it. Our next legislator is Bob Pritchard, and he's the first Republican to come up here today. And I'm going to tell you, it's awful hard to pass a bill that's fundamental systems change unless it has bipartisan support. And Bob Pritchard has not only been a leader on education policy in this movement, he was co-chair of the bicameral, bipartisan Education Legislative Caucus since its inception, I believe, and has actively worked his entire career for education. So, Bob. And you know, Mike, you're going to have to take 2 awards, because I got one for Brent Clark, too. And I want to tell you, the first draft of the evidence-based model was done in the offices of CTBA by Bobby Otter and me, and the first person we sent it to add on the distribution model was Mike Jacoby. And Mike Jacoby with the Management Alliance, the Education Management Alliance, was one of our closest partners in this effort, working with legislators, working around the clock. He really put in Herculean efforts. And poor Brent Clark, when we first passed SB1, so SB1 was the initial evidence-based model, we were sitting in a room trying to get the vote. And we'd send Brent Clark out to lobby X, Y, or Z legislator. And he'd come back and says, I got him, so now we got the vote, right? And we go, no, we just lost 2 more, Brent. We're down 1. So you got to go back out and get it. And Mike and Brent really kept the effort going, got that SB1 passed, and have been phenomenal partners of the CTBA in this. So, Mike? All right, so now that the evidence-based model is the law of the land, I would like each of you, in order, to sort of comment on what you are most pleased about having this happen, and then what you think the biggest challenges are we confront going forward as we implement the model. Kim, we'll just start with you. There you go, it should be.
There we go. Good morning. And thank you, Ralph and CTBA, for bringing us together to share insight on this wonderful reform. What was the question again, please?
What are you most pleased about during the course of this effort? What made you happiest getting this legislation passed? And then what do you view as the biggest challenges we confront going forward to implement?
Okay, so I believe I'm most pleased with the fact that we got something done. And not so much that it was just something, but it was very beneficial to the children that will be impacted, that it provided some measures that I had really worked for and wanted and desired within our school funding formula for a very long time. I believe that the evidence-based model, providing all the elements to get at all of the trenches that school districts need the most, and I'm talking about the most neediest school districts right now, because they've been so neglected for so long. So when we're able to add special services for special education teachers, identify with gifted education students, not all students that are in special needs districts are BAD, HDAD, BDD, and all these special acronyms other than PhD. They're not that. A lot of them are gifted, and we have not done a good job in identifying those gifted students in those neediest districts. So I was very impressed with that part of the legislation. Also, professional development for teachers. That had not been funded in our budget for a very long time, and I think that does a huge disservice when you're not supporting the actual teacher who is teaching the children. So special education, extracurricular activities, the areas that identify with social needs, all of those things is what I'm really proud of, that we were able to put into a base funding minimum. We were able to hold school districts harmless, and we were able to create, I believe, a fair distribution model. So it's a whole lot there, but I think those will be some of the highlights for me. What I'm concerned with, or what I see as challenges moving forward, is the financing. Being able to put adequate dollars into our education budget each year so that we can actually realize all of the benefits of those elements. So I believe that we still have some huge hurdles to climb in terms of making sure as a state that we provide adequate resources to ensure that we have a funding formula that's equitable, that's adequate, and that really gets to the needs of the children who need it the most.
Thanks.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Ralph. One of the true champions of education funding reform. Please give Ralph a fantastic round of applause. And the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. Ralph is truly one of the most modest people I've ever met before. One of the most modest, but we appreciate all of your hard work. The benefits. I think, like Kim said, first being able to get something done, at least in terms of the way we purported, this movement, this effort, giving school districts adequate resources, a level of resources that they've never had before. I'm pleased with the accountability. That's something that maybe it's just a buzzword, but everybody in Springfield talks about accountability in schools. So this is the first step in creating a higher level of accountability than we've ever had. So I hope districts are ready for it. because we take that very seriously. And when we at some point go back and look at what's happening, I just hope they're ready for whatever that conversation is. So for our superintendents, those that really push for this, I know they're working hard on it, but we just hope that it's an effort across the board, including our teachers, administrators, our communities as well. So I'm just real happy to be a part of something that happened, at this particular time in my career as a legislator. We talk about really helping the poorest of our children, or maybe I shouldn't say it that way, giving students across the board what they need at any given time. The model is supposed to provide avenues for whatever a child is dealing with, that school district can have the ability to meet that student what their needs are. So often we talk about, particularly in certain communities, that even before a kid steps foot in the door of their school, that they probably have dealt with something before they even get there. Whatever that may be, just on their walk to school, what they see on their bus ride to school, maybe it's something in a home. I mean, you name it, children across the board. And this is not something just indicative to poor or minority communities. A lot of children are dealing with stuff before they even get to the school. So we hope that when they arrive, this model provides that district the ability to really to address the needs of children, whatever condition they are when they walk into that door. And it's something that for me, not that others haven't dealt with it, but I have a 6-year-old who is a kindergartner. And so I think about what I did in the context of what it's going to be for her. Because sometimes in the morning, getting her out to school is a challenge. So we don't know what kind of mood she's in when she gets to school in the morning. So we hope that it does do exactly what we asked for it to do. And as far as the challenges moving forward, obviously money is going to be a challenge moving forward. Really examining that accountability and holding all of us responsible for that is going to be a challenge moving forward, because, of course, I think folks will say, well, we could have done better if, or, we'd like to have done better, but those ifs and those buts aren't going to be excuses for us anymore with this effort. They just can't be. And also one of the challenges going to be, I think, moving forward is, and I think, and I'll say this in the context of the General Assembly, so clearly to get to where we are was a fight. Everybody has different ideologies, everybody has different views. As much as we all say education is important, I think we've seen that it varies. What's important to everybody is different, and that came into the entire conversation of passing this bill. But it's going to be tough, I think, for us as a General Assembly, because there's, as much as we talk about the broad benefits of this across the board, there are still districts, there are still administrators who are not pleased with what we did, who are not happy with it, and that will start to bear out even more. So as much as we feel good about what we did, we know that everybody's not happy with this. And where you are in the state, if you have that kind of administrator, if you have that kind of community, they're going to put that pressure on their legislator. And so it's going to be a consistent, I think, constant struggle over time, with regard to this. And that's just, I guess in my opinion, it's sad that this is not an issue that we really could have all come together and been 100% behind. But, I think that's just the nature of what we do in Springfield. Some of the best ideas, just never appeal to everybody the way we like to think that they should appeal. But nevertheless, and I've mentioned this particularly at our bill signing, is that the work is not over yet. To say that we've passed it, that's great. But I mean, even yesterday, I had a conversation, as I was explaining to Ben, with my colleague Sam Yingling, who has a couple of districts who have state-sponsored charter schools who are experiencing, at least in their opinion, a negative impact from this. So yet, here we go, but that's fine, and we expect this. But as long as we're willing to come together and try to solve and fix these problems together, then at the end of of the day, we should be okay. So, but I'm very happy to have been a part of this and very pleased to have the opportunity to share this conversation in a different format, Ralph. I like the format, we're having a conversation today. So, but thank you all very much for being here.
Cocktails in a bit.
Thank you, and good morning. Actually, what I'm most pleased and really amazed by is the fact that we got anything done. And the fact that we were able to take 27 elements that many people have been working on for so long and bring them into the discussion about what is quality education and how should the dollars be used. So I'm most pleased that we now have an adequacy target for each school district. No longer are we going to assume 6119 is adequate for every school district across the state. We know there are different needs, and those needs are growing in most of our districts, rural as well as urban. And we now have a tool to help our school administrators and our communities and our school boards evaluate how they're using the dollars and where the needs are, and really focusing on those needs and saying, are we using the best practices? So the adequacy target was one of the big achievements that I think were a part of this. The fact that it's a bipartisan agreement is also a miracle. Because as Senate Bill 1 came to the floor, it turned in, through rhetoric and through other things, into a very partisan issue. This is the Chicago bailout. Well, it wasn't. But when people believe something, just like non-facts, that's what we believe. So we had to deal with that issue, and that's where compromise came in. That's where some of the issues that groups have been working on for decades were brought into the discussion. Whether you're talking about charter school equity, whether you're talking about a school scholarship that allows low-income students to have the same choice about the school that meets their needs as do wealthy people. So it brought in a number of things. And then for our northwestern suburbs that are highly taxed, it brought in an element that allowed them to say, if we're so much above adequacy, might we get a little tax relief? But most important is we're bringing the state into the reality of saying the Constitution has said it's your majority responsibility, but we've never funded it that way. Even back into 1970 when the Constitution was written, only 1 or 2 years were we anywhere near 50%. And we've slid now to something like 26% of state funding for our schools. So now saying that the state has to put more money into it and distribute those dollars to the least resource wealthy districts is really a game changer, and it's a massive change in philosophy of what we've been doing in school funding. The fact that we're now treating CPS like every other school district, I think, is a step in the right direction. If we're going to invest dollars for certain programs, then we ought to be measuring whether the dollars are going to those programs and whether we have the students that we have today like we had in 1995 when those formulas were created. So we're bringing equity into the discussion. And I think that's going to help all of us continue to focus on the needs that we have in students. And we're also going to look at the ability of school districts to have flexibility in some of the mandates that we've passed down from Springfield. It gives districts some freedom through local conversations to streamline the waiver process. Again, that was one of the elements that helped bring the bipartisan vote to the table. So there's a number of things in here that were compromised that take our school funding and our focus on education in the right direction. My concerns going forward, similar to what we've already heard, is going to be, will the state put the dollars in that we now are enthusiastically about doing? But even if we put only $350 million in each year, it's going to take us 15, 20 years, Ralph, to reach adequacy. That's way too long. We've got to find ways to look at the priorities for our state spending and start putting those priorities into something that will change the outcome. change the ability of citizens to get jobs, and good-paying jobs, and buy their homes, and stay law-abiding citizens and avoid all of the judicial problems that we had. And I think that's what's going to be one of the big issues, is will we fund it the way we need to? The other big issue is the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act plan, that is married to the new evidence-based model. There is an accountability, and districts are going to really be struggling with that accountability, moving from 30% of adequacy in learning at the 3rd grade and 5th grade level to 90%, which is the state goal. That's going to be huge. And that's something that's going to take all of our effort to help our districts achieve the kind of gap narrowing that we envision today. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me say that I'm humbled to be sharing the stage with our legislative colleagues here. I feel like we did the playbook work, but you guys were the team that had to take that ball and score, and you guys did it. So thank you so much for the hard work that you did. It was really amazing. And I'm also humbled to be a spokesperson for so many people in the room that have been a part of the development of the actual plan itself. Michelle Mangan, we started talking about this in 2008 when she was at National Louis. Ben Boer is here. Bob Spatz brought just a really keen mathematical mind to the early conversations about how we do distribution and local capacity and so forth. So I'm really speaking for all of them when I think I'm sitting up here. In terms of what I'm excited about, I'm excited we held a lot of it together, because in any of these things, and I think, Representative Davis mentioned this, you could get derailed from what you intended on the front end in order to get what you needed to get on the back end. And we kept those 27 elements pretty much in place. Now, even though full-day kindergarten didn't make the final list, it's still there halfway, because you still get a 1.0 credit if you have full-day kindergarten compared to a half credit if you don't. And there's an opportunity to gain a little more adequacy target if you want to go in that direction. But when we looked at those initial evidence-based practices, we were able to maintain those in the model, because those are the return on investment. Those are the pieces that are going to really make a difference for kids. And so keeping that in place, not diminishing those, not giving those away in the negotiation processes was huge. I also think that I'm excited about the fact that our Constitution was mentioned in terms of the state's responsibility, but there are two really important words in Article 10 of the Illinois Constitution, and that is after it says that what we as the people of Illinois want in our schools, it says we want a highly effective and high-quality system of education for every student. And so we've set the table for that to happen. And for me, I've been in education for 38 years as a teacher and administrator and leader of an association. This is the first time I can say I think we actually could get there in Illinois. So that's exciting in terms of that. The game changer word was something that we used from the very beginning. We said not only is this a game changer for the actual funding streams to get dollars to the schools that need it the most, but this is a game changer on the educational side for educational leaders to look at those practices, to try to determine how they can integrate those into their system as they get more funded with adequacy. And even for districts that are already, in our Tier 4, over 100% of adequacy, those districts have to keep thinking about this as well, because the nature of their demographics continues to change. Low-income population is increasing in every school district in Illinois, not just in ones that have always been noted to be primarily low income. So there are needs that are going to emerge in every district. And so now there is a template. There's a template of the kind of practices that if you implement those with the dollar and resources you have, you can expect some student growth and student achievement. And as we walk forward into ESSA and looking at longitudinal and growth kind of models and thinking about the practices that could be funded through the evidence-based model, we are, I think, just at the gate of real change in terms of student achievement in Illinois. But the game changer on that local level is not an easy one, because communities are sort of fixed into their view of what education is, how they structure their budgets, and so forth. So we have a lot of work left to do, I think. Now, the lobbying is not so much at the legislative level, except for it will be for new resources, but it will be at the local level to actually implement best practices and get the kind of results that the model will achieve. I think my greatest concern ultimately is that we get a lot of listening now, but 5 years from now, it'll sift into the background. Even as Terry said on some of the things that were front and foremost in education reform, and then they sift away. And so it's going to be impingent on all of us to keep this at the forefront, not only in terms of funding streams, but also in terms of application.
Great. And Ben Bohr, where are you? Could you wave, Ben Bohr? There you are. Ben Bohr was instrumental in helping getting this legislation passed, and there was a point in time where CTBA moved off of doing complex modeling completely on the legislation and focused more on explaining how the legislation worked to different members of the General Assembly. Ben ended up doing all the complex modeling from that point on, so Ben deserves a big round of applause for his efforts. And of course, it was Michelle Mang's idea as she worked on the evidence-based model with the professors who developed it, Auden and Pikus, so Michelle, wave. And then Bob Spatz, of course, you also instrumental at the very beginning when we were talking about distribution models and how should those look when you have an under-resourced system. So Bob, wave, I mean, he gave a lot of thought and input into what became the final distribution model. So they all deserve acknowledgement, as does Senator Menard. So before I go to the next question, I'm going to give the audience a very short summary of the evidence-based model so you're really up to speed. Real quickly, it looks at those educational practices which over time have a statistically meaningful correlation to enhancing student achievement, and it funds them. These are those 27 elements you hear about. And it funds them based on the unique student population of every school district. So as Representative Pritchard said, there's no longer one $6,119 school funding foundation level for every school in Illinois. Every school district will have a unique adequacy target of resources it needs to implement these practices. And those resources are automatically designed to respond to student population. So for instance, in a middle school, for every 142 children attending that school, you get one full-time core teacher in each of your core subject areas, math, science, blah, 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 funded. And then for each 125 low-income kids, you get another full-time equivalent core teacher in each subject funded. And that low-income kid counts twice, once in your general population and then once again as a low-income kid. For every 125 English language learners, you get another full-time core equivalent teacher funded. And if that English language learner happens to be low-income, that child counts 3 times. So what you can see is it builds up resources for a district predicated on its unique student needs. This is something that, frankly, our old formula was completely divorced from the actual cost of educating children, and our new formula is tied to. And the state is below adequate. So if you look at how short we are of adequacy for all school districts across Illinois today, it is $6.2 billion. It's a big number. We're putting $350 million new in this year over and above last year, but it's going to take us a while to get to that 6.2. So some of the political challenges that you think we're going to confront going forward as we try to convince the legislature to raise adequate revenue to fund that, obviously current revenue sources aren't going to be enough. The state has an accumulated deficit north of $15 billion in a $36 billion general fund, only about $27 billion of which goes to services. So the bottom line is we have a major fiscal problem right now. Roughly half the budget is deficit spending. We need to find a way to raise adequate resources, and we need to find a way to stay honest to this model. What are the challenges, and how do you encourage bipartisan support going forward to stay on task, and in any order?
Wow. So I'm going to say this little word that I'm pretty sure many of you remember, and that's lottery. So everyone always wants to know what happened to lottery. It's supposed to fund education. Well, this year, Representative Ford and I passed a bill that we're trying to drive more dollars actually into education as it should from lottery. Actually, lottery grossed a significant amount of money with a very small percentage of those dollars going into the education school common fund. And our legislation also goal is to stop the legislature from taking dollars from lottery to use in other places before it funds education as it should. So that's just an area that we thought, just 2 legislators out of the entire General Assembly thought that we ought to start there, trying to get all of our colleagues to support that initiative actually wasn't a difficult thing to do. So I believe most of us felt that there was a responsibility there, and the legislation was passed with not a lot of opposition at all. But trying to be creative and come up with other funding mechanisms along the way, I do see a challenge there when we have this $15 billion deficit right now where we owe old bills. So I think most of the challenge between the parties is going to be creating new revenue dollars, a new revenue stream to fund education when we have all of this outstanding debt. So how do we do that? How do we create a balance where we're actually paying all of our obligations, paying our old debt, and generating additional new dollars for our education system? That was my wow. I really don't know how we get there. I'm hoping that we can collaborate in ways that we look at areas that we can shift funds around or move funds from that perhaps can share in. So some of those rainy day funds, some of those corporate loopholes, some of those things that we've been trying to do for a very long time. And then I'm hoping we can look to other states and see if we can come up with new ideas on generating revenue streams. I think we haven't done a good job over the years in doing so. And so wish us luck. And we accept any of your recommendations. I think a part of CTBA and all of you here as education stakeholders, I think our relationship should strengthen in that you see the direction we're hoping to go in and wanting to go in, and hopefully you have some suggestions that you can just submit to your legislator, and that we can put them on the table and actually visit the issue and see how do we generate the resources that need to be generated. Thanks.
From a slightly different point of view, because I've been around much of the state where legislators are being beat up for raising the income tax. So the notion that we'll just raise more revenue to solve this problem through increased fees and taxes is a non-starter for many of us in the legislature. So I think we need some creative thoughts about how we get the dollars that we know are needed in education without just raising taxes and fees. This last week, I visited a manufacturer near my district who had relocated a lot of his facilities out of Cook County because of the taxes. How many manufacturers and businesses have left Illinois because of the taxes? So simply saying taxes is the way we're going to solve this problem, to me, is ignoring reality and what citizens in this state are willing to do. So that's where I come back to say we've got to be creative. How do we grow the economy in Illinois so that instead of businesses leaving, we're attracting businesses? How How do we grow the economy through hiring more people and paying them better wages so that they in turn will pay more income tax and other ways that generate the revenue that we say we need through natural growth? How do we look at the way government operates? And I know Ralph and I have had this discussion many times, and he says, well, you won't save that much money. But if you ask any business about how they reform their operations every year, you know that the state that hasn't reformed its operation in decades could save significant dollars if they would use the modern way of doing business, if they would look at streamlining process. The comptroller 2 years ago identified an accounting procedure that would save millions of dollars every year. Our IT system that would come into the 21st century could save hundreds of millions of dollars through agencies using a one-system approach and avoiding a lot of the manual data entry that leads to errors, that leads to delay, that leads to increased costs for the citizens of our state. So I still say there is much money that can be gathered through efficiency in government. And we'll never be as efficient as many businesses, but we can certainly be more efficient as we are today. So the dollars are going to have to come from new revenue, but through growth. And revenue that we have spent more wisely. And finally, through prioritization of what will really make a difference with the dollars that we have. And we haven't done that very well. We get into a political discussion that you got to help my constituency, or we can't lose a facility in this part of the state. We've got to really come down to say, well, if we're going to reduce prison population, maybe we better give kids a better outlook when they graduate from high school. And if they aren't graduating from high school, how do we help them get those skills so that they can get a job and don't have a prison record and will be able to find a job? So those are some of the system changes that I think are going to be key to answering your question.
Sure. Mike?
Yeah, I would add to that, one of the biggest weights on the state finances is the pension obligations. And, if we're looking for ideas, CTBA has already published those ideas on how to level fund that into the future, as opposed to taking the increase in the ramp that was set in 1994 and continuing to embrace that. I mean, that eats up more than $1 billion of new money a year if we stay with that ramp as it stands today. So while we have, let's say, a quasi-balanced budget with the new revenue stream that was passed this last year, that's just on this year's level. And that doesn't talk about paying back the past obligations in the budget deficit, and it doesn't talk about, or doesn't meet the need of hitting the next level of pension obligation, which is going to come. So we have to deal with that. That big problem has to get leveled out, and I would definitely recommend the CTBA approach on that.
Yeah, real quickly, for those of you that aren't familiar with that. So in 1995, this pension ramp was established that backloaded payments due to the pension systems. In fact, for the first 15 years of that ramp, they simply codified the practice of underfunding the pensions and actually made the unfunded liability worse. They kept borrowing against what was owed to the pensions to cover their normal cost and using it to pay for current services and writing IOUs to the system. So what we've said is, look, this backloaded ramp that grows at an unaffordable, unattainable rate, as Mike Jacoby said, it's got to be thrown out the window. And you got to level out that amount and keep it at a level dollar. And if you do that, and right now we've modeled it out to get to about 80% funded in 30 years, which makes you healthy in the Congressional Budget Office size. If we did that, we would save around $70 billion from what the current ramp would require to go in. $70 billion. And that's money available for funding services or tax relief, whatever you guys want to do with it. But now here's where you should be angry, and this is why we should all be pushing this approach. CTBA's been talking about this particular reform since 2004. If we'd have done it in 2004, the level dollar payment would be roughly $4 billion. Today it needs to be over 11. So the longer you wait, because of the magic of compounding interest, the worse the cost becomes. So the sooner is better on this one. Do you think it's possible on a bipartisan basis to get this through? Will, do you see?
Well, I know when we've brought it up in the past, it just seemed to not go anywhere. So being on one of the appropriations committees, chair of appropriations, I've been a part of those broader discussions where you had the approach chairs, revenue chairs, talking to the Office of Management and Budget going back a couple of years. So for instance, we were under the impression that refinancing debt for what it's worth would be a good tool to use, something that businesses talk about as a good tool. When brought to the administration, they flatly said no. So as Bob talks about growth, I mean, there have been any number of ideas that have been put on the table that could start us down a better path and possibly lead to some of the growth that was discussed, and they were rejected. I'll even go back several years. For me, I'm a South Suburban legislator. I don't represent any part of the city. So out in the South suburbs, we've talked about building a third airport for years as a way to jumpstart growth and development. I mean, we see what happens around O'Hare Airport and Midway for that matter, so we think that that's something that we could use. The current administration has no interest in building a third airport. So if we're going to have a real conversation about growth, then let's have a real conversation about growth and put all of these ideas on the table. The South suburbs has been obviously neglected for a number of years. Ideas that we have brought forward that we think are important to start that growth, to start bringing jobs to the South suburbs, have been flatly rejected. So again, if we're going to have a real conversation, then we just need to have a real conversation. I don't disagree with Bob that growth in different areas is necessary, providing adequate jobs. But to the extent in which we have to work within the confines of the state to help bring some of those forward, if we have provided all the necessary research data to suggest that this is a good direction for us and it can't be disputed, then we need the support of an administration. It's not just this one. It was the previous administration as well under Quinn that didn't really feel warm to the idea as well. But, if we feel that this is something that's necessary, I mean, all of this has to work together. We have to stop working in silos with all of these different things. Right now, we're still just very siloed, and we don't have any real long-term vision. It's more about what's now. So if you talk about raising taxes now, it's bad. But in some cases, if you look down the road, there may be some benefit to having done something like a progressive income tax. That's something that we talk about could be a long-term benefit, provide us with long-term resources. But, we can't seem to think down the road. It's all about what does that feel to us right now? And when it feels bad right now, we say no, and those ideas just simply never go anywhere. I mean, I think there can be some bipartisanship in these issues. I mean, if these are good, sound ideas, and I'll, speak positively to the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. I got interviewed by, and I forget the gentleman's name just the other day. I guess they were doing some research on the organization, and what I told him was that this is an organization that has a nonpartisan or bipartisan board. Everything they do is peer review. So they send these reports out to the experts across the field, across the country, whether they're Democrat or Republican, and ask them, tell us honestly how you feel about what we want to put out. They do it that way. I don't know very many other organizations that do it that way, if any at all. I mean, we talk about groups that have a conservative slant or a liberal slant because that's just the way they identify themselves, but if their information that they're putting out goes through a high level of scrutiny, like what happens in CTBA, then why shouldn't we be looking toward an organization like this to help provide some direction? And that's not to say you agree or disagree, but again, they're reaching out to experts in these fields and asking them ask them to tell CTBA what they think about what they're doing. And they don't publish anything that hasn't been peer reviewed, and they take that feedback and they make adjustments to it. So this is an organization that I think, and again, maybe I am biased, and I'm okay with that. I own it, I accept it, But an organization that provides us with good information, accurate information, and it tells us really what we should be thinking or what we want to know. Sometimes it's not the most positive or favorable stuff, but this is the direction we want to go. So if we can use organizations
organizations like this more to help provide us with just information about how we should be addressing some of these issues, we might be in a better shape. But we kind of get too caught up in I'm more conservative, I'm more liberal, or whatever the case may be, and we just find ourselves not moving anywhere.
Thanks for that, Will. And by the way, questions can go on during the panel discussion. Gabby of our office is out there with a microphone. If anyone has a question you want to ask of our panel, please raise your hand, and Gabby will come to you and get your question asked right away. So thanks for that, Will. Those are very kind words. Kim, you looked like you were going to say something, or no? Okay, so then here's, I think, one of the political challenges. A lot of legislators are resigning. And in particular, a lot of moderate Republican legislators, Bob, are resigning. That ought not be. So what's that going to do going forward to this discussion? What are the unique challenges that presents, and how could this discussion be kept positive, non-ideological, fact-focused? Do you have any suggestions?
So when you started out this morning saying you were euphoric, I thought maybe you were euphoric because I was retiring.
Not the case. In fact, could you all encourage Bob before he leaves today not to resign, please?
Well, I appreciate that. One of the challenges that we're all going to be facing is just the politicization of our nation right now. When you look at how diversely polarized we are from Washington to California, it just shows that what we're seeing here in Illinois is not unique. And we've got to find a way to focus on, as Will said, and what CTPA's been doing is real facts that are peer-reviewed. And I was just thinking that you're out there with your data. There are other organizations out there with non-peer-reviewed, and I consider very unfactual, that convince people and convince legislators. And we have polarized camps right now. And I think a lot of the legislators that are resigning are looking at that polarization. They're looking at the choice of leadership and the dollars that are required to get elected nowadays, and just saying it isn't worth it. I don't think we're going to be able to move the needle and accomplish the goals that each of us individually has in the next 2 years. So why bash our head against the wall? That's the challenge that legislators have and that citizens have, and how we can encourage the legislators to be more thoughtful. We've got to find ways to move people from the edges more to the middle, and I'm saying both parties. We've got to find ways that people can come back and do what politics has always done, and that's compromise. We've always been a very diverse country, but our government has worked because the legislators that we elected knew at the end of the day they had to move the ball forward. Today we have too many legislators that are willing to just stay on the 20-yard line. So as citizens, we need to encourage the legislators that are elected that there's got to be some movement, that we've got to address the issues that are facing us, not only in Illinois, but in the United States. And I come back repeatedly to say that's the strength and also the weakness of a democracy. The citizens have been lulled into believing their vote doesn't matter, they don't register, they don't vote. And we get the polarization that we have today, because there's always some groups that will do those things. So those of you that are in the middle, you need to be more active. And that's how we're going to change the legislature, and we're going to start really dealing with some of these tough issues.
Thanks, Bob.
But that means, based on the elections, at least the way they are being portrayed right now, that if, and I'll just say the other side of the aisle for me, swings further to the right, then we're just going to be stuck for a little while. And it's going to be tough to get big things done, because it's all going to be partisan in nature. So we are facing some serious challenges in the General Assembly moving forward. And I'll just say particularly in the House.
I would just add that we should take away from passage of this legislation the practices that we use to help get us here. I think a lot of times when we do something well, we do not build on it. We allow the media and the little negative connotation to kind of supersede the good that comes from something that we accomplish. So with even in this reform here, it was so much good about this legislation, but all you heard was the private voucher, scholarship tuition. That just rang over and over and over again in so many press outlets that became the discussion, more so than we have this wonderful school funding formula for the first time in decades. That was not the caption. And I think as legislators, we have to be better listeners to one another and be open to the process. And I think what I found that was really impeding our process was that we were given different information at different times. So each caucus knew something different. But once we began to hear the same message at the same time from experts, then it's very difficult to kind of venture off into your own ideas when all the facts were laid out to you equally. So when the Senate and Senator Menard did a fabulous job, and when we established the Education Fund Advisory Committee, the Senate was just hearing things, but the House was not. And so it took years, it seems, at least 2 years, for the House to get caught up on what we had already heard. So when we began to have these conversations, it was repeated information that some of the same specialists came back 2 years later to tell us the same thing that we were told 2 years prior. The exact same speeches. And so at some point, we have to, in the General Assembly, be on one accord enough just to gather the information so that we can all be empowered with knowledge at the same time and then be able to just assess what it is that we've learned. And just an example, I never mentioned tax increases up here at all, but Representative Pritchard came back and said tax increases is not the answer. And I thought, well, where did he hear me say that? And so I think that's an example of we have our own partisan politics no matter what, and we have our own beliefs, but we have to be open to what we hear each other say and respect each other as legislators, no matter if you were there a year or 20 years, no matter if you have great ideas or you have no ideas at all, but you're open to the process. And I think that will get us much further than where we have been, and I think we can accomplish things a little quicker than we've been able to.
Okay. Well, every time that I hear that either a Republican or a Democratic legislator is going to resign, I think that means our coalition has to stay together and brief the new people, because they're coming in without any knowledge of where this was, how it got here, the long, hard fight, the meaning that it has, the hopes that it has for the future, and so forth. And again, that's one of the challenges I think that is hard to maintain, because as we get 2 years down the road and those changes start to happen, we're going to have to mass up our troops a little bit and get out there and really spend some time educating people on this wonderful thing that happened in the end in a bipartisan fashion, and that being a model for how other things could happen as well, but also don't lose sight of the fact that we are on a pathway to adequacy in school funding, and we can't let it step back.
Right. And so, and please, I'm going to solicit questions from the audience after this one question. Make sure you guys get engaged and get all your questions answered. I'll tell you this, these legislators will actually answer your questions. None of them will give you a spin. So you have a real opportunity here to get some questions answered, and Mike Jacoby has encyclopedia knowledge of all things school funding, so he could answer any questions there. But Mike, I really think one of the biggest challenges is going to be on accountability, and in particular, the state is $6.2 billion short of adequacy now. We're putting $350 million in. Let's say they put another $350 million in next year, although query whether we'll have a budget next year, but $350 million in next year. Everything I've read suggests we won't see significant measurable progress in that 2-year cycle, even with a new $700 million investment. And certainly the opponents of this sort of reform that's saying you're throwing good money will be loud on this issue. So how do we best counter that, and what kind of infrastructure do we need in place statewide to counter that?
Well, first of all, we need the actual accountability measures within the Act to start taking place. So every district filing a spending plan that articulates how they're going to address these state goals, how they're going to address ESSA growth requirements, what type of infrastructure they're putting in place to counter the impacts of poverty, to address EL needs in their district. All those things have to be articulated. And we're a year away from actually starting that process of actually doing that work. Once that starts, I think then it's really about identifying places where they choose one of those elements and really commit to it, and doing some longitudinal measurement of that impact. Because when you think about a scalable model of adequacy, if you only take that small increment of dollars you get and you spread it across 27 elements, it's going to take you a generation of students to even get close to 90% of adequacy, and therefore you're not going to be producing results. And so one of the things that we've talked about as a management alliance is looking for districts that want to pinpoint on one of those elements and really implement it, and then begin to do some research studies on that impact. But again, you're right. You can't get that impact in 2 years. You might be able to start seeing some of that impact in 5 years with an implementation of that type. But if this is just incremental across all education spending, it's going to be very difficult to see results.
So this is probably where the conversation gets to me a little difficult. So we've passed it, and to the extent in which Mike just outlined maybe some of the challenges moving forward, or what his suggestion is, I mean, in the audience are superintendents right now, and there probably are some other school board members. I know there's Ms. Jordan from School District 144 and a couple of other other superintendents. Do it now. Start now. Start trying to figure out how to get this going now. There's no reason for you to wait. Now, the tough part of this is going to be how the administration is going to be working with the teachers' unions, to be quite honest, in my opinion, because there's not always the best relationship that exists there. So, but if we all agree that this is and was the right way to do it, then let's put aside the differences, start figuring out how to come together and try to make it work. Because I think what Ralph said is that people are going to start already starting to nitpick, and we already have naysayers. And there was a lot of time, effort, and work put into this by all the advocates, by legislators, to try to get us to this point, and I would hate to see it all go to waste. So again, as much as we have our challenges, let's try to put all that aside, and let's start figuring out how to get it going right now. You are the best. You know, you are out there. You are ready to go, hopefully. So let's start doing it, you know. Again, and I know it's a tough conversation because, you know, that those relationships aren't always the best, but it's going to be important for our administrations and our unions and our teachers to come together and start doing it now. You know, as much as it may take 5 years, that doesn't mean that there can't be something measurable in the next year or two. You know, something that we can tout, something that we can point to that came out as a result of passing this bill. So let's start working on it now. If you have feedback, use your legislators to provide that feedback. You know, don't just sit on it and seethe for 2 years, and then 2 years later talk about something that we should have talked about 2 years ago. Let's not wait, ladies and gentlemen. We don't want to lose a generation of kids. We just don't. So let's start working together collaboratively at all levels immediately so we can start getting this going and getting to those results that I think we all desire.
Did we have a question, Gabby?
Hi, thank you. My name's Katie Gruber. I'm here representing Raise Your Hand today, and I appreciate your point about a lot of press focusing on the tax credit scholarships after the passage. And I just wanted to ask you about the slippery slope of taking public money and diverting it to private and parochial schools. And I'm especially concerned about schools that I know Catholic schools teach a science-based model, but other private schools do not. And what does this mean for our science education in the state if we are funding schools that teach a broad variety of science models?
Do you have anyone on the panel in particular who'd like?
Representative Pritchard.
So this goes back to something that I heard Mr. Mazzani mention, and maybe I didn't hear him correctly, but he said that parents and children ought to have choice. And the system that we have today doesn't allow all of the parents to have choice. If they have a failing school district, a public school district, what do? Can they pick up and move to a better public school? Or do they go to a private school? And what the advocates, and I certainly wasn't a part of the advocates that wanted the school scholarship, what they were saying is if we allow wealthy families to go to private, why not allow low-income families to go to a private school? And why not attract more dollars into the educational system through the tax credit than what we're getting today? So to me, that was a net gain. If you're getting millions of dollars more into education funding, shouldn't that be better? And this was one of the compromises that we had. But we need to come back and look at, are we helping every student succeed? I was hoping, and I've always been working, that we can do that in public education. But there are some kids that don't learn in the way that we're now teaching in public education. So back to Mr. Mazzani's comments, how are we moving into a new generation of digital learning and virtual learning and learning in different styles and learning at different speeds? That's what our public schools haven't addressed very well in many cases. And that's where charters may have helped in some cases. So having a variety of educational delivery models, to me, is something that allows families to make some choices. But we certainly do need to come back, as has already been mentioned, and look at accountability and look at student growth and require that of all our educational institutions. And that's where, tax and budget accountability can be one of those voices that says all students should have a choice, but all students should have a growth opportunity, and we should narrow the gap that exists today in our student population.
Yeah, so I'm just going to respond to your question a little bit and your question from earlier about longitudinal studies on this. There was a really good one done by a married couple out of the University of Illinois, Chris and Sarah Lubienski. They were initially retained by the administration of George W. Bush, and they were given access to data sets that allowed them to look at student performance and compare it public school, private school, charter school, blah, 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 blah. It's the most robust longitudinal study ever done, and the first study was just a one-time study, but then they updated it with a longitudinal study afterwards. And what they found was, at initial blush, certainly you see private schools outperform public schools on test scores overall, but when you adjust for demographics, public schools actually do a better job of educating low-income kids. And private schools do not do a particularly good job there. And the other finding that they had was particularly poorly performing are not Catholic, but more conservative Christian private schools. So it's an interesting question, right? Because you're going to be taking public taxpayer money and subsidizing choice that, some kids may use to go to a great Catholic school and enhance their educational opportunity beyond what their local public school could provide and really move up. Others may make the choice to go to one of these private Christian schools where, in all likelihood, their academic performance will not go up. So you may may even go down. So it's a real challenging issue, and I really suggest you look at the work of the Lubianskis if you haven't already, but it's great stuff.
Let me just add one other thought. One other provision of the school scholarship is the fact that any student that takes that scholarship has to be assessed the same way public school students are assessed. So maybe we'll get a little more accurate data and certainly answer that question of are they learning in a different environment, different than the way they would have learned in a public school.
Great.
Okay, thanks. Hi, Dan Montgomery, IFT. Thanks, Ralph, and thank you to all of you for the work on the evidence-based model. We're really grateful that, you know, one of the greatest stains in Illinois in terms of our inequity in education funding is on a path to be remedied. My question goes back, and it's really for anyone. Someone mentioned the ESSA, and we're not thrilled with where the state is right now in an ESSA plan. In our thinking, ESSA was going to really free us up to address equity issues even more. So I'm very concerned about that. And a couple people referenced the school funding plan with ESSA. So I'd like to hear anyone's thoughts about the intersection of those two things going forward and where you think there might be problems or opportunities. Thanks.
The state superintendent was in my district this last week and talked somewhat about how these two systems are going to work together. And the fact that the state board has a number of task forces that are looking at different elements at ESSA as well as the new funding formula to see how they can make it easier for districts to report and to take into consideration the dollars that are necessary to achieve the kind of growth that we want to see in the ESSA framework. So I'm hopeful that through that collaboration, and that collaboration is open to everyone, because they have a question and answer dialogue on the state website that allows people to raise questions that you have about one or the other systems and how they're going to work together that would perhaps challenge the state board and how they're going to guide and set the state standards and then apply the state learning standards. But I think one of the issues that we can't overlook is the fact we have to be focused on student growth. And you can raise questions about how do we measure that student growth, and there's test fatigue and districts perhaps assessing too much, taking away from the instructional time. But that's where, again, we can have a public discussion in each of our districts about what's appropriate and what's necessary to feel confident that our investment in education is producing results. And they're not arbitrary results, they're student growth results. So we're looking at each student, and the low-income student as well as the gifted student. Are they growing, or are they just treading water? And we have social promotion, and we have kids that can't read at the 3rd grade level or do math at the 5th grade level. We have that in every district. We've got to find a way to now help every student grow. And I think the models we have are there. They're certainly going to take a lot more input and coordination as to how we use them together.
I think from the school funding statute, the focus is on transparency as opposed to accountability. So it's about what do we intend to spend our resources on that we believe will produce the kind of results that we want. And the other side of that, the accountability side, I mean, we advocated for a lot less emphasis on high-stakes testing, and that got pumped up a little higher than what we wanted. The balanced accountability model that was passed almost unanimously by the House and the Senate and signed by the previous governor was a great template, I think, to actually, be able to look at the multitude of things in a school district that can contribute to academic growth and achievement. But of course, then ESSA now requires this gross statistic kind of a measurement piece that's going to be a little more challenging. But I think you need transparency on the front end, how we're going to spend our money, and you need the accountability that did it work on the back end. My fear is that the assessment of that accountability will be skewed toward too much, again, towards high-stakes testing and not enough toward the other parts of an educational program that really predict achievement.
Yeah, and one thing that's exciting about the opportunity the evidence-based model brings to the table from an accountability standpoint is for all voters, taxpayers, stakeholders to know the capacity of their local school district to actually generate these outcomes. So if your desire is for a school district to be at, pick your outcome, 90% of its kids at grade level in third grade reading, whatever, but your school district is only funded at 68% of what the evidence suggests it needs for students to succeed academically, you're not going to be there. And I think that has to be incorporated in any final accountability model. And hopefully what everyone will take away from that, and when I say everyone, I mean everyone in this room that's going to be working on ensuring that this model not only stays in place but gets adequately funded, is say that's now an accountability measure for the General Assembly. If they're still underfunding education significantly below what the evidence suggests it needs for students to succeed, they ought to find the way to fund it. And if that requires re-amortizing the pension debt, if that requires, in our opinion, at CTBA, expanding the sales tax base to include consumer services, whatever it requires, you need to go do that. And I would love to see this capacity aspect made a core element of any accountability system going forward. All right, one more question. I think over here we have Nancy. Well, we'll do two, and then I'd like a quick closing comment. Oh, Dr. Leak has a question. All right, we'll get you two. Three.
I'm Nancy Brandt from the League of Women Voters of Chicago. I want to ask about accountability that might happen at the district or even the school level, particularly schools that have school-based budgeting. Do you expect superintendents and even principals to become conversant with the 27 elements so they can articulate where they're moving toward them, and to equip parents as well so they can encourage moving toward best practices?
I would say absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely yes, on all three.
Yeah, and in fact, the cheat sheet's the statute. The elements are laid out in the statute, and that's an amazingly powerful tool, I think, as Dr. Jacoby was saying, for transparency. I mean, there's no more hidden guesswork here. Here are the elements at work. If you want to do a little research, you could look at the effect size of those different elements and go to those elements that have the highest effect size, that is the strongest correlation with enhancing student achievement over time. So for instance, professional development has an incredibly high effect size if it's done the right way. Tier 2 interventionalists, an incredibly high effect size. So there really is a cheat sheet now available for folks to use, and the hope is they will.
And I would just add that the model requires every school building to report its spending and how it's closing the gaps in the student in that building. So no longer can we look at district averages and gloss over the underfunding that's going on in a lot of our local neighborhood schools. And CPS comes to mind as one example where I've seen high investment and great results in one school, yet in another school in the same system, underfunded to the point they don't even have a librarian or a counselor. We're now going to be able to see the dollars that are invested in every building and be able to judge whether they're getting a fair chance at encouraging their students to grow.
Okay. Okay.
Hi, I'm Ann Gillespie, and my question is about vocational education and whether you see that as having a role in these elements going forward, given the desire to grow the economy and how that can help with that as well. And then just as a comment earlier to your points about people leaving and retiring, I'm here as a candidate today to learn. So I think you'll find there are several people running like me who are very interested in helping this get to the next level. There won't be any dearth of energy there.
Excellent. Well, in the model in terms of vocational and all the other sort of specialized instructional areas, whether it's arts and music and those kinds of things. The way the model works is that there's a percentage of allocation of teachers based upon what the core number of teachers would be. So the larger the core, multiplied times the percentage to get those specialist teachers, so they should be able to, to fund those experiences as well.
I would just add that career and tech ed is what we used to call it, is so important. When you look at the percentage of your graduating classes from high school that have a desire to go on to college. They've been forced through the matrix to say, yes, I'll go on to college, when maybe they're really not interested. And the careers that they do have an interest in don't necessarily require a four-year degree. We've got to find ways now to allow students to look at the career options and the job opportunities and say, I can go over here to the community college or a trade school or a union-provided school and get the certificates I need to a satisfying career. And that's the way we're going to move all of our workforce to the 60-some% that need something beyond high school to service the jobs that we're going to have in the next few years.
And there also needs to be an investment from the business industry as well. I think for years, businesses relied on government funding training programs. Well, that money has gone away, so business now has to figure out ways to put resources in to help provide their own training. I can speak to the utility space. Where we've worked with companies like ComEd, Ameren, Downstate, Peoples, and Nicor Gas, where they have what is called the Construct program, where they have put in money, as well as some of their subcontractors have put in money to create a training program to help train their own workforce. And we're hoping that other segments of business industry look to what they've done and create similar programs. We talk about the need for more people in manufacturing because the sons of those manufacturers that were there don't want to go into it, but there's still populations of young people who are good with their hands and they just don't know that these opportunities exist. So we're trying to push manufacturing in the same vein to put money in themselves, create their own training programs, and help develop their own workforce and not just look toward government to provide those resources. So it is a very important part of this whole conversation as well.
First, I am a superintendent, and it is my responsibility to know those 27 elements, absolutely. And as a superintendent, I've been very active with our community and our board, not just talking about them, but also about the impact size and the ones we've already implemented. But my struggle as a superintendent right now is we want to continue to add to that, so we really want to get to those class sizes. We really want to add more instructional coaches. The issue that we're struggling with is there is a tremendous shortage of people, high-quality teachers available. So even if I reduce my class sizes to accommodate for 15 from 20 that I have right now, it's now finding those high-quality teachers. So my question really is, I am so excited about this model. We're right now trying to figure out what else we can do, but we need some help finding bodies, and in particular in those low-income minority communities that not everybody wants to come and service our children. So have you all thought about that, or is there any legislation or anything that might support us?
I'm glad you brought that up because teacher shortage is a huge, huge challenge that we begin to have discussions around. I'm working with a Senate Republican on identifying challenges and barriers to teachers, and we knew years ago that we would come up on where we are now in terms of teacher shortage. And so some people say, well, there shouldn't be a basic skills test at all, just wipe it out. And some will say, well, let's just treat it like charter schools. You know, it's not necessary that all the teachers should be certified to teach. But then you're going to have some that say, absolutely no way. How do we know if they're quality teachers? There's no mechanism, no metric to measure them. But then I took a look at the Illinois Board of Higher Education, and I looked to see how many young people are enrolled in our university system as teachers. That percentage is so low. is so extremely low that we're not creating new teachers right now. We have the Apple Foundation, we have certain opportunities, but overall, the desire for young people to teach has been erased because you constantly hear teachers don't make enough money. And so you have this young population of people who say, well, why should I go in that profession if I won't be able to take care of myself or my family? So the passion for teaching is not in this generation right now that's enrolled in schools. So as a legislator, one of the things I've been thinking about is how do we encourage and get our young people more involved in wanting to be teachers and enrolled in our university system as teachers? How do we wipe out some of those challenges when there's teachers moving in from different states and they have to take our test, although they're already certified to teach in other states? I mean, there's quite a few barriers to our teachers' shortage challenge, and that's something that I'm diving in on, and I don't know that it could help solve anything immediately, but I think that attention is definitely on that subject, and hopefully we can try to gear up the population quickly.
So we've passed a couple of bills here in the last year that dealt with career and tech ed teachers, that dealt with teachers outside the state coming in and being recognized for their teacher licenses, but that only scratches the surface. You know, there's a shortage in substitute teachers as well as regular teachers. And this is an issue that I'm now hearing the Board of Higher Ed as well as the State Board of Education talking about, of how can we encourage more students to look at teaching as an honorable profession. It seems like we've almost drifted to the point that we no longer respect teachers or respect the authority or the knowledge they have. And it's time we got to do a culture shift and start strengthening again the credentials of our teachers in respect. And I think that perhaps there's some schools that are already looking at how they can encourage 6th, 7th, and 8th graders to start looking at teaching, and looking at high school students, looking at doing some in-class types of teaching and internships in other school districts. And that's a way that I think we can create the interest, the respect, and of course, compensation has to come along with that. And the funding model, I think, is starting to address that issue. So there's a number of things that are being done. There's a lot of work that's got to be done coming forward, and certainly all of your involvement and looking at the solutions are going to help us come back to address the issue of shortage, respect, and having the quality teachers that we need.
Hi, my name is Ed Noyes, and I'm a retired superintendent from a long time ago, but not to date myself or anybody sitting in the room here with us. And I was glad to see the superintendent from Prairie Hills District 144 is here, because about 44 years ago, I was sitting in a large group, then I was a beginning administrator, a lot younger then, and I then heard we had just been announced in 144 that the resource equalizer formula had been passed. And that was a great boon to all of us, and the Prairie Hills of the world, the 144s of the world, were going to benefit greatly from that. My question of Mike is, and Mike is not anywhere near as old as I am, Dr. Jacoby, that is, pardon me, Mike, I hated to embarrass you that way, and the other legislators, is what is different in Springfield now? Because where the resource equalizer formula failed, it didn't reach the 50% funding level. If you look at what the positive planks were of the resource equalizer formula, 1972 or 73, if the state had stuck with that 50% funding level, at least now we're down to what, 33, 37 in Mississippi and Arkansas. No slamming anybody from those states. But what's the temperature? How are things different now to fund it over this 10-year basis that were not there over the past 40-some years with that formula? Thank you. Thanks.
Well, I think one of the things that we put into the statute that wasn't there before were some expectations on minimum funding levels. And so those are in place. The minimum funding level and its macro is $350 million. $50 million of that could be peeled away to property tax relief, leaving $300 million. So if that measure is not met, then the formula changes. And I think that will actually give us a better impetus to get everybody fighting for additional new dollars every year, no matter what tier you're in terms of funding, because if that formula changes because we don't meet the minimum funding level, then districts in tiers 3 and 4 are really going to get no dollars at all, and it's going to flow primarily to the districts to the farthest away from adequacy. And so that's a piece that wasn't there before, and it does set sort of a standard that we hope will be met every year. Minimal standard.
Okay, we have one last question, John, and then we're going to close.
Thank you. This is for all of you to answer, but really is talking to the state reps, then we appreciate all the work that you're doing. My name is John Miller. I'm with the University Professionals of Illinois. My question really is what is it going to take to get the policymakers, wherever they might be, to start viewing higher education at the same level as K through 12? And the reason why I say that is that over the last 15 years, we have seen higher education cut by 40%. We have seen student debt scream up to over $30,000 graduating average here. We have seen 77,000 students in the last 2 years leave higher education in the state of Illinois. We have seen faculty and staff leave at unprecedented amounts to get out of this system because of the lack of support that's there in it. And we have a university that's not too far away from here that's still on the verge of challenging whether or not it can survive, and that being Chicago State. Infrastructure is falling apart at every one of our campuses, and we question and we wonder why we have a shortage of teachers when there's $30,000 in debt coming out for a job that might pay $40,000. I know several teachers who are struggling as their first couple years just to try to pay their debt. So the question then becomes, how do we start seeing higher education, and what can we do to see higher education at the same level, especially when we know that somebody attains a degree or advanced certificate, sees their unemployment rates go down and their long-time lifetime learning's going up. Thank you.
It's a very good question, and it's one that many of us are starting to talk about now that we've got the K-12 issue on the right track, is how do we get higher education on the right track? And certainly funding is a part of that. We've had governors for a number of years that haven't been advocating for higher education, and the results show the effect. So all of us, legislators, citizens, have to start saying the importance of higher education funding has to be looked at, and the efficiencies that are now starting to be talked about, and there's a bill that's been introduced to look at the ease of entering college and focus of centers of excellence at our universities, avoiding some duplication, a way to share the dollars that we've got more efficiently. That conversation is just starting, but I'm encouraged to say that it is started. So please keep raising those questions with your legislators, and we're going to try to keep that focus, and hopefully we can get perhaps a governor's commission like we had in K-12 in higher education, and bring legislators together in a bipartisan fashion and craft out a formula moving forward like we've been able to do with the evidence-based model.
Well, I was trying to maybe try to figure out a way to answer your question without being, I don't know, controversial, maybe the word or whatever, but I guess the challenge that I have with universities is I guess their desire to be prestigious, and I guess what I mean by that, and there's nothing wrong with that. So years ago, so let me just say, for 6 years I was a college admissions counselor for Southern Illinois Carbondale, and it had a tradition of having the highest percentage of African American students of any of the other state universities. It felt like that was part of its mission, was to educate particularly African Americans throughout the state. You know, so they had not only a regular admission requirement, but they also had a provisional admission requirement that allowed for certain students to come in based on a variety of factors. And not that other schools didn't have provisions like that, but that was a particular focus. So fast forward, so early in my term as in the General Assembly, I was driving home and heard the president of ISU at the time, a guy named Bowman, talk about that he was trying to turn ISU into an Ivy League school, which I get, but he wanted to turn it into an Ivy League school based on raising admissions requirements and only allowing a certain type of student to come in. He didn't say anything about the quality of the education, not that I'm questioning that, but, you know, so I questioned him about it. So I said, I thought our state universities were supposed to be kind of the place where anyone in the state, and then I wasn't trying to say everybody had to be admitted, but, you know, you allow for certain types of students. But his idea of raising the requirements, he was trying to become the U of I, so to speak. And we talk about that being the flagship school, and I've even got my issues with them because they have lower numbers. So part of the challenge is the fact of that they haven't done a good job of being representative in their incoming student populations of the entire state. They're trying to not allow certain students, for lack of a better way, to come into their university. So when university presidents are ready to address that question, then you might find a little more favor, I think, from certain legislators in the General Assembly. Because to the extent in which you want to exclude students, then, you know, I'm not saying that you shouldn't exist, but, you know, as much money as you want to operate. And I wish I knew the bill number of the bill that the University of Illinois president came and presented in committee, where he's asking for kind of unfettered funding without any accountability at all. I mean, he had the nerve to ask for that. And then when we questioned, you know, your efforts toward African Americans, he had no answers. You know, he said something we can look at or we can think about. You know, so maybe what Bob is suggesting in terms of having some kind of bigger conversation, maybe that's something, maybe that's a resolution that he and I can introduce in this last session to at least start that dialogue moving forward, because we need to have some conversation on holding our universities accountable for educating every student or potentially every student in the state of Illinois. Some of the reason why you find children are leaving, like my son goes to Iowa Wesleyan because he plays baseball and none of the schools in Illinois recruited him. So a school in Iowa recruited him and he went to go play baseball. So, I mean, to the extent in which those universities are recruiting more out-of-state students, then it's almost, what do you expect our in-state students to do? You know, they're going to go where they feel like they're welcome and wanted, so to speak. So there's a bigger conversation that exists there. Obviously, we can't solve it today, and we hope that university professionals will be a part of the conversation, but also willing to accept the same type of criticism that you might level against us as legislators. Hope university professionals are willing to, you know, accept that as well.
I would only add to that, I share some agreement with my colleagues have said. However, I've got to be honest in that we've not done a good job in supporting our higher education system. In fact, over the last couple years, I think we completely eroded the system. We've caused quite a few of our universities to have these massive layoffs. They've closed down departments. They're not offering programs for certain degree level for their major. A lot of the minors have been wiped out, and so we've made ourselves less attractive. And so in terms of competition, those schools outside of Illinois will draw Illinois students away because they just provide a better package, and they're giving them some financial support. I don't know that we've done a good job in our universities in giving financial support to students. And so the whole eroding of the MAP grant, oh my God, you know, not only are you not accepting students who are of color or have some challenges, you're also saying those students who can't financially be here shouldn't be here. And so I think we have an obligation as legislators to find a way to not only make our higher education system a top priority, but to have the discussions around, we're working really well with preschool. We've invested in early childhood education over the last couple years. We've been working on K through 12, but make higher ed a priority. And so I want to thank you for being an advocate for the higher education system and even bringing the subject up, because I think that we're not acknowledging what's happening at Chicago State University enough. And it shouldn't just be African American legislators fighting for a state university. it's all of our school, and I think there's division and competition within the university system, and that creates a big problem as well. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and I'm going to go back again when I asked you to help me come up with funding streams. Also be willing to throw out some suggestions on how we solve the problems, and not just from your perspective being at the institution, but think of the legislators and what Representative Davis just acknowledged, how we see things and what our constituents are saying to us and the complaints that we hear. Be open to that. You know, the administration needs work, right? And legislators need to be open to, we need to do a better job. And then I think we can get somewhere.
Okay, 30-second close from everyone on the panel, starting with Mike.
I'll just say this is the beginning, not the end, so let's keep the energy up and go get them.
Excellent. Representative Pritchard?
The efforts of all of us to get to this point and now to implement not only the K-12 portion, but to deal with the higher ed portion, we're going to have to stay together. We're going to have to continue to advocate. We're going to have to continue to have the kind of data research that's peer-reviewed that CTPV has always done.
First of all, thank you for allowing me to be here. And again, this is merely the beginning of the conversation. Senate Bill 1947 has set a great floor for us, but now it's time to build upon that. And as the gentleman suggested, that conversation now needs to move into the higher education as well as the vocational education realm, so we can provide quality across the board for all of our young people here in the state of Illinois. So again, we can produce the type of adult that we all like to see here remain in the state.
Generating revenue is something we have to do. We have to come up with the way to fund this school funding formula in order for it to work. And the quicker it works, the better it would be for all of our students. We'll be able to acknowledge student growth. We'll be able to close the academic achievement gap. We'll be able to do many things that we need to do to get our kids to our higher education system. Teacher shortage is something that we need to work on as well, so that we can make sure we have those high-quality teachers available to also support the 27 elements of this program.
So, systems change is hard. My organization, we're bipartisan. We work on these long-term issues that we see in public sector systems. What we try to do is analyze the systems to see if they're working the way they were intended to work, if they are actually promoting access to opportunity, social and economic justice for everyone, or if there's flaws in those systems. And if there's flaws, not only how do you resolve those flaws utilizing best practices, evidence-based research practices, how do you pay for them? And what's the way to sustain your investment over time? So as you can imagine, we spend a ton of our time at the CTBA banging our head against walls, right? This is hard stuff. June of this year, June 1st, if you'd have asked me, will the state have a budget? I'd say no. If you'd have asked me, will the General Assembly pass a tax increase to fund a budget? I said no. And if you'd have asked me, would we have transformational and historic change in our school funding formula on a bipartisan basis? I would have said, hell no. Yet by the end of August, all three of those things happened. That wouldn't be the case but for the efforts of the individuals you see here at this panel. The political leadership you all demonstrated to not just get the school funding formula done, but to work on a budget for the state of Illinois, to work on the tax increase. And Mike, just the countless hours that you put in as an advocate, going down, attending meetings with me, Ben Bohr over in the corner there, holding hands. You know, I was nothing but impressed and amazed and humbled to work with all of you. Where is Bobby? There he is, Bobby Otter. So the bottom line is we got to a pretty good place this year. If you ask me, will we have a budget next year? I'm going to say no. You're going to ask me, will we have the revenue to fund what we need to be funding? I will say no. But at least we have the school funding formula. and we have these people to thank for it. So my final thank yous are going to go to you in this audience for coming, Senator Menard, who couldn't be here, but we'd like to recognize his efforts, and my wife, one Mary Kay Martiri in the corner there, who's a partner at a law firm and covers for me as I spend Memorial Day weekend, 4th of July weekend, away from home, down in Springfield, holding legislators' hands and making sure the wheels don't come off at the home. So thank you all for your support. I really appreciate it. Let's make this school funding formula not only stick, but let's make it be fully funded so that every child has the opportunity to realize her or his potential. Thank you for coming.